wind screamed across the frozen field, whipping ice crystals against my face like shards of glass. My lungs burned with every shallow breath, and each step sank into the snow, stubborn and unrelenting. Somewhere ahead, a faint, desperate whine pierced the emptiness, a tiny, fragile sound that made my chest tighten. I stumbled closer, heart hammering, and then I saw it. A small German Shepherd puppy, shivering violently, trapped inside a metal bin that had been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Its eyes, wide and terrified, met mine through the frost-lined cracks, and I felt something break inside me. How long had it been here? How many nights had it fought the 40 degrees F without warmth, without comfort, without hope? I crouched beside the bin, every instinct screaming to reach in, to lift it into my arms, to make the cold stop. The puppy's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and I could feel its tiny body trembling as if the frost itself had claimed it. Time stretched in cruel slow motion, each second a battle, each breath a reminder of how fragile life could be, how brutally the world could abandon those who needed it most. And yet, in that frozen silence, something unspoken passed between us, a plea, raw and unfiltered, for survival. The world was a blur of white, broken only by the jagged outline of a metal bin half buried in snow, its edges rimed with frost. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, searing exposed skin, and carrying with it a sound that made my chest tighten. A whimper, soft at first, but persistent, sharp, human in its urgency, even though it came from a creature far smaller, far more fragile. I stumbled through the snow, boots sinking with each step, lungs burning as if the cold itself had infiltrated my chest. Every breath came out as a thin wisp, disappearing instantly into the frozen air, leaving me shaking, not entirely from the cold, but from the anticipation of what I might find. And then I saw it, a German Shepherd puppy, no more than a few weeks old, crammed into the bin as if the world itself had discarded it here. Its tiny body pressed against the metal, fur matted with ice, eyes wide with raw, unfiltered fear. The cold had already painted its fur in frost, turning what should have been warm brown into a patchwork of white and black. I crouched beside it, careful not to startle it, but the whines only grew louder, a trembling, plaintive sound that made the snow around us feel emptier, lonelier, more oppressive. It was small, too small to survive much longer without help, and yet it fought, kicking its legs, nuzzling against nothing, desperate for warmth it could not find. I pressed my gloved hand against the bin's cold metal, the sharp bite of ice shooting through my fingers, and I imagined how it must feel to be trapped, to have the wind whip past you with nowhere to escape, to have your only hope be the faint shadow of someone passing by. I whispered softly, though I doubted it understood, though the sound barely registered against the roar of the frozen world, and still it responded with a tilt of its head, a shiver so violent it made my heart ache. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets, coating my hair and eyelashes, dimming the horizon into a featureless expanse of white. There was no shelter here, no promise of warmth, only the endless bite of the storm and a small, vulnerable life pleading for survival. I pressed my hand against the metal again, trying to measure the thin heat that might still linger from the puppy's body, wishing I could transfer some of my own warmth, wishing I could make the cold stop entirely. Its eyes, dark and glistening, held a question I could not answer. Why here? Why alone? Every instinct in me wanted to reach in, to scoop it up and hold it against my chest, to let it know that fear would not have the final word. But the bin was icy, slick, unyielding, and I hesitated, terrified that a wrong movement might push it further from life rather than closer to safety. The puppy's head finally lifted, ears flicking in cautious attention, eyes softening just enough to hint at the recognition of safety. We began the slow, tentative retreat back toward shelter. Each step was an ordeal. Snow resisted every movement. Ice threatened every footfall, and the weight of the storm pressed relentlessly against us. Yet the puppy clung, small paws resting against my chest, trembling with every motion, yet holding on. It was as if its survival depended on trust, not just on warmth, and I realized that rescue was not only about pulling it from the cold, but about coaxing it into hope. Every whisper, every careful adjustment of our position, every brush of my fingers against its fur was a negotiation. The world had abandoned it, but I had not. And slowly, a tentative rhythm formed between us, a fragile connection that balanced fear with possibility. By the time we reached the first signs of shelter, a snowed-over lean-to abandoned to the elements, The storm had softened slightly, though the wind still cut through cracks in my coat and sent shards of ice into my eyes. I laid the puppy down on a blanket I had pulled from my pack, wrapping it tightly, pressing warmth back into its frozen body. Its small chest rose and fell erratically, shivers still racking its frame, yet I could feel a subtle change, a reluctant trust settling in. It was not yet healed, not yet safe, not yet whole, but it had taken the first step from despair toward survival. And in that moment, standing amid the snow, wind, and faint pale light of a sun barely visible through clouds, I understood something profound. Hope could exist even in the coldest, harshest places. It was fragile, fleeting, but alive, and it had found us both. The lean-to was a sanctuary of quiet, dim light spilling through cracks in the walls, dust motes dancing in the slanting beams, carrying with them the scent of old wood and frozen earth. The puppy lay curled on the blanket, tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular rhythms, fur damp and clinging to its fragile body. I stayed close, shifting my coat around it like a shield, watching every subtle movement, every shiver, every flutter of its eyelids. The cold had retreated slightly, but the trauma was embedded deep, etched into its muscles, its bones, its instincts. I could feel the remnants of fear radiating from it, as if the frost had left an imprint that would not melt away with warmth alone. I whispered softly, letting my voice weave through the space, not just for reassurance but as a promise. You are not alone. Over the hours, I introduced the simplest forms of care, small sips of water from a carefully tilted bottle, tiny morsels of soft food placed near its muzzle. The puppy's head lifted each time, eyes flickering with curiosity and hesitation, a dance between hunger and fear. Its trembling decreased in moments, only to surge again with sudden noises. The whistle of wind, the groan of timber, the snap of ice outside. Each recovery was fragile, each small victory earned through patience, not force. I learned its rhythms quickly, when to stay silent, when to offer warmth, when to let it rest. And slowly, imperceptibly, trust began to weave through the spaces between us. It would not approach freely, would not yet curl into my hands or lap, but it allowed me near, allowed me to move with it, to move for it, without triggering panic. That alone was a triumph, a small, invisible thread of hope growing taut and strong. As the sun dipped behind a horizon smudged with winter gray, the puppy attempted its first tentative steps across the blanket, legs splayed awkwardly, head low, tail tucked like a fragile metronome measuring fear against courage. I held my breath, heart hammering, as it staggered forward, faltering, then pausing, eyes wide and locked on me. And then, after a hesitant wobble, it found a rhythm, a tentative coordination that seemed impossible just hours ago. Relief crashed through me in waves so sharp I nearly cried aloud. This small, struggling creature was learning to inhabit its own body again, testing the boundaries of strength it had almost forgotten. I reached out, letting fingers brush its fur, not forcing contact, only allowing presence, and it leaned just slightly into me, as if acknowledging that survival could now include comfort. The evening deepened, folding the lean-to into shadows, and I draped additional layers around the puppy, letting the quiet seep into both of us. In the stillness, I imagined the nights it had endured alone, every hour stretching endlessly, every shiver a negotiation with death. Now each exhale it drew was tentative, but it was life moving in, filling spaces the frost had emptied. I spoke softly of warmth, of food, of light beyond the storm, not knowing if it understood words, but hoping that tone alone could carry meaning. And as I watched it drift into uneasy sleep, I realized that recovery was more than physical. It was learning to breathe again without panic, to trust a presence that would not harm, to embrace possibility without expecting betrayal. By nightfall, the puppy had claimed a small corner of the blanket, curling into a tight ball with a cautious sense of safety. I sat beside it, listening to the wind batter the walls, feeling the pulse of life in the tiny body that had fought so hard to persist. Every twitch of an ear, every soft exhale, every small adjustment was a reminder that trauma left scars not always visible, but that healing, however slow, was possible. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I understood that the bond forming between us was no longer just about survival. It was about the reclamation of trust, the fragile yet insistent growth of hope, and the first inklings of a connection that would define both our lives. The days passed slowly. The the lean-to becoming a fragile island of warmth against the relentless cold outside. The puppy had grown steadier on its legs, each step less of a struggle and more of a tentative exploration, yet the shadow of its abandonment lingered like a ghost in its eyes. Sudden movements, sharp sounds, even the flap of my coat could send it retreating into the farthest corner of the blanket, trembling as if the storm had never ended. I learned quickly that survival alone was not enough. Trust, fragile and deliberate, had to be earned again, step by step, moment by moment. Each day presented a new challenge. A loud crack of ice outside, a gust of wind that rattled the walls. Even my own attempts at play sometimes triggered panic. One morning, after the world had been painted pale and quiet by an overnight snow, the puppy approached me hesitantly. Its head low, tail flicking uncertainly, it inched forward to sniff my hand, then darted back to safety. I held my breath, letting it set the pace, resisting the urge to pull it close, to comfort with force. Slowly, over the hours, the pauses lengthened, the approach grew bolder, until finally, it allowed a light brush of its nose against my fingers, a tiny momentary acceptance of presence, a fragile acknowledgement that perhaps I was not the enemy. I marveled at the courage it took to even make this motion, understanding that survival had not erased the memory of betrayal. It only gave the chance to confront it again. The test of trust was constant. Each time I moved too quickly, each time I reached for it without care, the puppy flinched, yipped, or retreated. I realized that healing required patience, not only from me, but from the world itself. It needed repeated assurances that warmth could be constant, that human touch need not hurt, that the world could offer more than pain and abandonment. And so I waited, watched, and mirrored its hesitations, letting the rhythm of my own breath match the tiny breaths of its body, coaxing courage from the smallest signals. A flick of an ear, a cautious sniff, a paw pressed just slightly against my hand. These were victories invisible to the untrained eye, but monumental in their quiet, steady affirmation of resilience. One afternoon, as the pale sun glinted off the snow, I tried something daring, a game of chase across the small stretch of lean-to floor. I tossed a scrap of fabric gently, and the puppy lunged, then froze, then lunged again, ears pinned, tail flicking nervously. Each attempt was hesitant, yet it grew bolder with each repetition, the fear gradually tempered by curiosity, the terror slowly replaced by instinct and play. I laughed softly, a sound I had almost forgotten could exist here, and the puppy's ears twitched in response. It began to explore inch by inch, learning the boundaries of this new world where hands were gentle, warmth was constant, and the frost no longer ruled every inch of its body. Evening came, folding the snowed landscape into muted blues and grays, and I watched the puppy settle into the blanket with a cautious sense of ease. It had not forgotten the harshness of abandonment, but it had begun to learn that some presences did not harm, that touch could be a gift rather than a threat, that survival could evolve into something more. Each step, each tentative paw forward, each flick of the tail toward me was a test passed, a trust earned, a bond deepened. And as the wind moaned outside and the shadows stretched long across the wooden floor, I understood that this fragile trust, built from moments measured in breaths and hesitations, was the bridge between despair and hope, between survival and life reclaimed. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed in a brittle, crystalline silence. Snow sparkled under the pale sun, each flake reflecting the soft light like a promise that warmth could exist again. The lean-to, once a fragile refuge, now felt alive with the slow rhythm of recovery. The puppy moved through the space with newfound confidence, small paws patting lightly over the floor, fur catching the weak sunlight, as if it were reclaiming the world inch by inch. Its eyes no longer darted at shadows, no longer carried the frantic fear of abandonment, but held a cautious curiosity, an openness that had been impossible weeks before. Watching it, I felt the weight of what had been endured, the frost-lined nights and desperate whines, and I realized how tenuous life can be, and how profoundly hope can transform even the smallest, most fragile creature. We ventured outside for the first time, stepping cautiously onto the frozen ground. The puppy hesitated at the edge of the lean-to, tail tucked low, muscles tense with uncertainty. I knelt, letting it approach on its own terms, feeling the tension in its tiny body as it tested the snow beneath its paws. Then, almost imperceptibly, it stepped forward, sniffing, pawing, exploring, and with each movement the ice of fear cracked further. Its nose caught the scent of the wide open world, the smell of pines, snow, and life beyond cold and abandonment. I followed silently, letting it set the pace, witnessing a transformation that was as delicate as it was profound. The shivers that had once consumed it now came only in small, fleeting tremors, more from excitement than terror. We found a small patch of sunlight filtering between the trees, a golden rectangle that seemed to promise warmth and safety. The puppy paused, turning its head toward me, eyes soft and trusting, a look that said it had endured, survived, and begun to understand what connection felt like. I lowered myself into the snow beside it, letting the light warm our faces, letting the quiet of the moment fill the gaps left by fear. It nudged my hand, tentative at first, then pressed closer, tail sweeping lightly in rhythm with my own breath. And in that small, luminous space, I felt the culmination of every step, every hesitation, every whispered word and gentle touch. Survival had become more than endurance. It had become life reclaimed, trust rebuilt, hope realized. The days that followed were filled with cautious play and exploration. The puppy ran, leapt, and tumbled in the snow with the freedom it had been denied, ears back in joy, eyes bright, and every movement a testament to resilience. It learned to chase its own shadow, to investigate the frozen trees, trust the warmth of my hands without flinching. Each small victory, each hesitant advance into the world, was a triumph over the abandonment that had threatened to define its life. And in those moments, watching it discover the sheer delight of existence, I understood that the bond we had forged was no longer about rescue alone. It was about connection, about the promise that life could be more than suffering, about the quiet miracle of trust and love finding root in a world that had once been nothing but harshness. As evening descended, painting the snow in soft shades of pink and lavender, the puppy curled into the warmth of my coat, eyes heavy with contentment. And for the first time, I felt a deep, unshakable calm. The storm, the frost, the fear, they had not been the end. They had been the prelude to something stronger, something more enduring. Life, warmth, and a bond forged in hardship, now radiant in the fragile light of a winter sunset. I traced the line of its small back, heart full, and thought of the journey that had brought us here. From shivering fear in a metal bin to this quiet, luminous peace. The puppy lifted its head slightly, nose brushing my cheek, and in that simple gesture the story came full circle. We had survived, we had endured, we had emerged into the light together, and the world, once indifferent and frozen, had finally softened, if only for us.